So welcome everybody. I'm thrilled to be here today. My focus is normally working with commercial clients, so this is a new experience, bear with me. And I hope to share a lot of insight as well as learn a lot as well. I have 20 minutes, and I'll try to answer three broad questions during that time. What's the state of AI today among the very largest companies globally? How will they deploy AI trade-offs? How will they deploy AI? What are the trade-offs, opportunities, and challenges that they face? And what are the 2 or 3 main considerations for success, whether it be in the commercial or in the public sector? We think the two really overlap with each other. We'll answer these 3 questions in light of 8 key trends that I'm going to go over in a second, while also noting, and this is important, that not all companies and institutions are created equal. So from our research, we saw that there was a 10 to 20 times difference in investment, deployment focus, commitment between the early stage companies when it comes to AI and the more mature. Now, this would be okay if one company was $1 billion and the other was $100 billion, but these are all companies in excess of 40 to 50 billion. So while companies are moving very quickly in this area, there's still a lot of uneven deployment across the range of applications for AI. So we start our analysis in terms of framing AI deployment within what we call the 21st century enterprise, which is centered on 3 key pillars. The first is data strategy. Captain Kanan emphasized the importance of data and analytics, the adoption of a cloud-first infrastructure, and the recognition that an ecosystem is going to be necessary, that companies can't do all of these things themselves, that they need to rely on partners, as-a-service solutions, and that deployment is not just about technology, but it's about organizational capital as well. So it's an ecosystem both externally as well as internally within the enterprise. Now I'm going to jump into this study. So this took up almost a year to do. We started it last December. And we did this with the recognition that there's a lot of supply-side research. So what Microsoft is doing, what Google is doing, the analysts write about this all the time. But we didn't see a lot of really hardcore research from the demand side. So what are large commercial enterprises doing from an AI perspective, AI and automation perspective? So we did extensive secondary research looking at job postings, type of jobs, type of organizational commitment that companies are doing, as well as a very large scan of who is mentioned in the press. And we tried to organize companies based on what we saw as their activity. We then went and interviewed roughly 40 of these companies, so companies like Bank of America, Novartis, MassMutual, Exxon, so a group of very large companies across a range of different industries, speaking typically to either the CIO, Chief Digital Officer, or a major line of business person. And what was kind of interesting is, even when we talked to line of business people, they had a pretty good idea of what was going on within the rest of the enterprise. So while some of our interviews were somewhat focused, we felt we got a pretty good feel for where these companies were from an overall deployment standpoint. This took a long time, but we felt that this was really the only way to get to this rich data set. So from this, we derived 8 key trends. We also derived a lot of other information, which I can share, but I don't have time to do in 20 minutes. So the first is that automation, AI, analytics, low-code platforms are converging. Enterprise demand is growing. There's a rapid shift from experimental to applied technology, not evenly across the enterprise. So this is in kind of fits and starts by department and by function. But I would say out of our 200 companies that we looked at, there's pockets of AI going on at all of them. New organizational capabilities are critical. This is more than just technology. And if anything, this is kind of the most key trend, we think, where it's really an organizational commitment It's a management commitment. It's a commitment to establish linkages between technology and line of business to drive these solutions, because, as Captain Kanan says, they are so pervasive and they are so addressing end-to-end problems. Internal governance is a key area. The need to control AI is a critical component. Companies are just beginning to get their heads around this today, surprisingly. The rise of AI as a service, something that really didn't exist when we started this study. So 12 to 24 months ago, this notion of an AI as a service ecosystem was new. Now Microsoft, Google, as well as a million not a million, but thousands of smaller companies and service providers, using microbots as an example, will be providing services across the whole myriad of applications and functions. This is a game changer in terms of companies really beginning to accelerate AI deployment. And the last is AI shifting the competitive landscape, or in the case of government, beginning to shift that cost-service equation. So I'm going to jump into the trends. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. So we see this rapid shift from experimental to applied. Today, about 26% of companies are deploying RPA at scale, so about a quarter. We see this growing to about 85%, almost 100% within the next 3 years. So for both back office functions, middle office, customer service functions, AI, RPA, we think, will become almost ubiquitous. And it's becoming this way now for many back office applications today. For AI, and AI we include more broadly machine learning, cognitive computing, natural language processing, making the distinction with RPA and automation. About 17% of companies are doing this at scale. We see this jumping to 50%. I think that's conservative. I think the numbers may approximate what RPA is doing. And 30% of companies today are still using this within functional areas to a large extent. So they're not using it at scale, they're not linking applications across the enterprise, but they're driving AI, natural language processing, within a function such as finance, such as HR, such as customer service processing. So the technology is providing value today. So it's not experimental, companies are doing it, a few companies are doing it at scale with, we consider, very significant investments. But as I said before, the market isn't homogeneous. And this was kind of a surprising finding from the research. We thought that all 40 to 50 to $100 billion companies kind of act the same. They don't. We saw 4 distinct segments, starting at the bottom left. Early characteristics here is limited enterprise governance. They're still kind of defining the focus and the use cases. Some of the people we spoke to, their big question was, do we take a top-down or a bottom-up approach? That's kind of an early-stage question for people. The aspirational and evolving segments, they've kind of moved beyond that, where they've got frameworks for evaluating projects, prioritizing, developing ROI, as well as putting in place that foundational governance structure, at least within a function, in some cases among the evolving and maturing companies, on an enterprise-wide basis. And kind of what's important from a maturing standpoint, the distinguishing characteristic is very top senior management commitment, where the chief digital officer may not actually report to the CIO, but rather to the president or the CEO of a company. And they have responsibility for AI strategy across the entire enterprise and control all of the COEs, which are doing AI and automation deployment. So it becomes really a very important corporate objective. Not many companies do this, but we do have examples of companies that are moving in this direction today. We discussed this earlier. There's the trend of the convergence between low-code, basic visual object-oriented programming, which will make it possible for a wider range of employees to do programming around RPA and around AI, data and analytics, automation, AI, we can't separate these things. So there's not an automation group going forward, there's not an AI group, there's this kind of transformation group using these technologies and having an underpinning from the organization to deploy this on a scaled and on an enterprise-wide basis. So as you begin to put together organizations, we think that these pieces really have to fit together, and that in-house talent, we think, and from examples we've seen, can really work across all of these different technologies. So it's not a siloed approach by any means. If we look at the third trend, enterprise demand is growing. So it's growing very quickly, but AI as a percentage of IT spending still only makes up 1% to 2%. There's a few examples of companies that are spending 5 to 6% of their IT budget on AI broadly, NLP, automation, machine learning. Most companies are spending somewhere between 1/4% and 0.5%. These are still, I'm going to show some numbers in a second that actually delineate this more. But some companies are really moving faster than others. So in our mature segment, in my 4-quadrant previously, the most mature companies have roughly 300 to 400 people, we estimate, working on AI and automation. It's kind of hardcore computer scientists and engineers. And this we see growing to roughly 600 to 700 in the next couple of years for this group of companies. Now these are big banks, big farmers, big insurance companies. Just the spending for the people is roughly $75 to $100 million. If you add in all the rest of the support, tools, applications, these investments can go up to a couple of $100 million relatively quickly. So we see examples of some companies really laying in some very heavy investments, not just for back office, but in many cases for predictive analytics, front office, driving more customer intimacy and more customer engagement. This is happening today. And we saw use cases and examples where companies are really getting very significant improvements, both in terms of productivity as well as customer engagement and greater sales. We saw roughly a 15% company, this is very hard to get from people when you interview them, but they have a feel that they're getting about a 10 to 15% productivity improvement within specific functional areas as they begin to deploy automation and productivity. Across an entire enterprise, this can be very significant. We estimate that, at scale, this can have a 1 to 2% impact on pre-tax earnings as companies make very, very large investments in this technology. This is an example of how we group the companies into segments. So after doing all of the research, we kind of went back and said, what are the defining characteristics that define maturity? And we saw that as the amount of money people are spending, the pace at which they're spending, and how much faster they're going to increase their spending over the next 2 to 3 years, management commitment, kind of in organizational structures that are in place, linkages between IT, the COEs, and senior management, expertise, technical expertise, as well as organizational expertise, and governance. We rated companies on a scale of 1 to 5. So this is a little hard to see, but the maturing companies basically scored, not surprisingly, very high among all of these things. But there was a large group of companies, this aspirational and early group, that scored relatively low across all of these. We think that they can begin to catch up using some of these as-a-service offerings, as an example. So not having to lay in all internal investments to drive forward. But kind of interestingly, the more mature companies are spending, as I said earlier, an average of a couple of $100 million, growing to roughly 300 to 400 million, whereas the earlies are spending 10 to 15 million. So this starts to frame kind of a have and have not type dichotomy and picture, even for AI. And I think Captain Kanan kind of alluded to this also, that different departments or different groups. Some are spending more, some are spending less, but this was kind of a surprise. This was a surprising finding to us. But we think that even these less mature companies, the early and aspirational, will have opportunities to catch up as tools, as a service becomes more widely available. So going to the next trend for organizational capabilities, AI is not just about technology. We thought it was when we went into the study. It's really about process, it's about management, it's about technical expertise, and kind of communication across the entire enterprise to demonstrate the benefits and promoting the use cases and successes that companies have. One healthcare company, as an example, established a $100 million budget for AI. That's interesting. But what's more interesting is they have a steering committee of the CIO, many of the senior vice presidents within the lines of business, and they meet twice a month to discuss projects, initiatives, investment plans. So this is a very big time commitment, a very big management commitment. And I think this is the point I want to emphasize here. It's just not a money, but it's a time, and it's also the expertise on the part of senior management to really be advocates as well as a team that can steer where the company is going to go from an AI perspective. So again, it's not a group of people kind of over here working on these specific applications. If you do that, you're going to stay in the early category forever, and probably lose competitive position. It's really this senior management commitment and driving that organizational understanding throughout the entire enterprise. Trend number 5 is governance. This kind of is obvious, but again, the more mature companies are putting governance in place to drive both scale and scope and to begin to embed AI within the entire organization. So establishing COEs is critical, either at a functional level or at an enterprise level. But there's this understanding that governance is just critical. Things can't be done willy-nilly. Many companies have done this, taken this approach, and then now they're stepping back to really take a much more disciplined approach. So this notion of linkages, management commitment, governance, these are really this is the bedrock and foundation, much more so than how much, what tool do I choose for this, or how much am I spending on that. It makes the conversation a little bit more complicated when it comes to AI deployment when you begin to consider all of these factors, especially these people and management factors as well. And these are just some statistics, some kind of fun statistics. We got asked early in the study about how do you identify use cases. I think this is becoming a little less important because people take basically many different approaches. They take a top-down approach in some cases, a bottom-up approach in others. Most companies kind of take a mixed approach to this. But again, management oversight, senior management oversight is very critical, whether you take a top-down or a bottom-up. Governance, about 30% of companies were in the process of establishing COEs. Kind of interestingly, a quarter have global COEs. They may not be the most well-functioning, they may not touch every single part of their AI deployment, but there's a recognition that this has to be managed. And then this begins to link back to a control framework as well. And this was kind of interesting. We asked about who takes the leadership role, kind of heavy technology, CIOs, but this emergence, and again, this really didn't exist 2 to 3 to 4 years ago, chief digital officer, chief data officer, and kind of the linkage between these lines of business people, chief data officer, chief digital officer. We think this trend is really fundamental to helping drive AI, both from a technology as well as from an organizational standpoint within these enterprises. I have 5 more minutes. 3 more trends. So trend 6 is the need to control AI. This is basically the ability to control algorithms as they become more powerful and opaque over time using machine learning and cognitive computing. Only about 25 to 30% of companies that we interviewed are investing heavily in control. What you normally see is companies begin to do AI, then they step back and start to put the control frameworks in place. I would say from a public sector perspective, looking at this right from the get-go and linking this and embedding this very strongly within your governance processes is really a best practice. Otherwise, you have the potential to be slowed down. In the case of companies like KPMG, we have things like the PCAOB and government regulations and oversight where this isn't a nice to have for us, we have to do this. And we're deploying AI within many parts of our organization, from a tax, from an audit, primarily from a tax and audit perspective. But this control framework is part and parcel of what we do. Trend 7 is the rise of AI as a service. I touched upon this earlier, but we think this will really change the landscape, not just from Microsoft and Google providing these services. So they're each laying in, we actually interviewed both of these companies as part of this study. They're making very significant investments. So it's not just the investment, but also the application developers that they're bringing into their network. So just as Microsoft developed tens of thousands of application developers for Windows and for Office, they're on the same trajectory to do it for AI automation and machine learning. So this is going to provide a very large infrastructure, as well as smaller companies that will, look for opportunities to automate, every little single piece of processes within large companies, whether they be back, middle, or front office. So this, we think, is a very large game changer as well. And this is just a quick graphical representation of spending today. So we estimated among the 200 companies we interviewed or analyzed, they're spending roughly $17 billion on AI broadly. So AI, machine learning, robotics, NLP. And they spend, about 2/3 of this they spend internally. They build applications, they buy tools, and about 1/3 they use outside contractors or as a service solutions. We see this shifting. So the build is going to grow to 1.5, and the whole market's going to encompass roughly $36 billion. But the buy side's going to increase by almost 4 times. We think this could even be conservative, that the buy side could increase even faster as these kind of standard processes become better understood and applications are applied against those. So this, again, this is an interesting fact, but I think this is an interesting opportunity to really look at that entire landscape and ecosystem that can help drive deployment. And finally, AI in shifting the competitive landscape, or in the case of government, shifting the kind of cost-service equation. So, there's a few things. Again, there's this 10 to 20-fold gap between the mature companies and the early companies. So it's going to shift the competitive landscape faster for some companies than others. There's productivity benefits to be had, but there's also this kind of changing nature of the, of supplier-customer relationship that we think that AI will underpin in many, many strategic and important ways. So, in parting, we think it's imperative to make AI and automation integral to strategic planning and use it as a service differentiator, linking it to other critical investment opportunities like cloud, like robotics, and like data and analytics generally. So it's critical, strategic, organizationally focused, and offering, we think, great opportunities in the future. So that's the end of my formal speech, and I'll be happy to take a couple of questions. Thank you.
I've got a
Yes,
question
in
there
the
in the middle.
front.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Among the companies, especially the aspirational maturing ones,
Yeah.
were there any common business problems or challenges that they had that led to them to go early into AI and start utilizing it?
So start use, well, in the case of some of the banks and insurance companies, they have very complex back office processes. So these are organizations. I'm just going to stand over here so I don't have the light in my eyes. They've got lots of people doing lots of routine tasks. So there was this kind of understanding that you could take advantage of a lot of low-hanging fruit as you apply automation first, but then AI on top of automation. So, companies like energy companies struggle a little bit with this because they've got this kind of complex supply chain downstream, upstream thing. Their back office is large, but not as big as, let's say, the banks and insurance companies. So we saw from our research they had a little bit more trouble prioritizing use cases and kind of driving this across the entire enterprise. It could be due to, let's say, the diversity of what they're doing and kind of the way their businesses are set up. So I'd say, so that's one example. Another was a very large technology company. They had this really big problem of getting their salespeople to price large deals all the same way. There was no conformity. There was a very strict approval process if you didn't follow the rules. They applied predictive AI to this problem, where all deals run through this predictive agent. I'm kind of simplifying this, and within 6 months they got 90% compliance on this, and they think they're going to drive revenue. This is going to have a significant revenue impact and a lot more uniformity in terms of how deals are priced. So this was a big problem they saw. No uniformity. Apply AI straight to it. So kind of cost and revenue considerations, I think, are what drive people initially and are examples of what more mature companies are doing. Did that answer you? Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Another question. We've got time for one more.
Okay.
You highlighted the convergence of like automation, low-code platforms, AI,
Yes.
and analytics. Is there kind of one, or maybe it's a combination of all of them, but is there one that kind of helps open the door for companies to then start utilizing the others? It's kind of like a warm and fuzzy introduction.
Yeah, data, I think, is at the foundation of all of this. So companies can't, I think, effectively drive AI if they don't have a well-grounded and comprehensive data strategy, and also have their data stores and data lakes in some type of order that they can actually extract information from. So I think kind of having an enterprise data strategy is the most foundational piece, and then you can kind of build AI right off that. Automation kind of sits to the side a little bit. So you can do a lot of stuff with RPA vendors and automation without necessarily having your data strategy completely in place. There's just so many processes that can be improved without having to go back to the major data stores that companies have. So I'd say data is the foundational piece.
Okay. Well, join me in thanking Don Ron. Appreciate it.
Thank you.